Hey guys, tonight we dim the lights and drift back through time, far across the ocean to Edo-era Japan, a place as vibrant and complex as any you could imagine, but with shadows lurking just beneath the surface. You find yourself standing on the edge of the Yoshiwara district, the famed floating world, a segregated city within a city, pulsating with a life unlike any other. Imagine the air, thick with the scent of incense, perfume, and something else, something a little less pleasant, maybe exhaustion. The sounds are a dizzying mix: laughter, shamisen music, hushed whispers, and the shuffling of wooden geta on cobblestones. It's a place designed to dazzle, to make you forget the mundane world outside its walls. But let's be real, if you were actually living here, you probably wouldn't survive this experience for long without some serious resilience, or maybe just incredibly good luck. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step through the main gate, the omen, and the outside world seems to melt away. This isn't just a neighborhood, it's a universe unto itself, walled off and controlled, a place where beauty, art, and desperation danced a never-ending waltz. The district was established in 1617, a designated area to consolidate and control the pleasure quarters of Edo, which you now know as Tokyo. It was later moved after a devastating fire, becoming the new Yoshiwara you're now entering, a meticulously planned grid designed for both luxury and surveillance. You walk down the main street, the Nakamachi, lined with grand houses, or Oirin Yado, their latticed windows casting intricate shadows in the lantern light. The facades are elaborate, adorned with decorative carvings and the crests of the establishments. It's a spectacle, meant to overwhelm your senses and draw you deeper into the illusion. As you move through the throng, you notice the different types of people here. There are wealthy merchants, samurai, though they had to leave their swords at the gate, a rather important rule for obvious reasons, and even curious visitors from other parts of Japan. But your focus is drawn to the women you see, some peeking from behind the lattices, others more visible depending on their rank. This is where you would live, if fate had dealt you a different hand. You wouldn't be a client, you'd be one of the women trapped within these walls, bound by contracts, often sold into this life at a young age. Your journey here doesn't start with a choice. It starts with an arrival, perhaps in the dead of night, handed over by a desperate family or a predatory broker. You're taken to one of the houses, maybe a large, well-known one, or perhaps a smaller, less reputable establishment. The first thing you learn is the sheer scale of this place. It's not just a few streets, it's a small town, with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and its own unique culture. The houses vary dramatically in size and luxury, reflecting the ranks of the women they housed. At the top were the Oirin or Taiyu, women of extraordinary accomplishment in arts, music, and conversation, who were more entertainers and conversationalists than readily available companions. Below them were various other ranks, down to the lowest, who were little more than laborers and were far more accessible, though often in much harsher conditions. Your initial days are a blur of confusion and fear. You're stripped of your old identity, given a new name, and immediately immersed in the strict, almost monastic routine of the house. There's no gentle onboarding here. You quickly grasp that your life is no longer your own. Every minute is accounted for, every action governed by the house rules and the demands of your future profession. You see older women, their faces painted stark white, their hair elaborate structures adorned with countless pins, moving with a weary grace. You hear the constant hum of activity, lessons, chores, preparations for the evening. The district itself is a character in your story. It's a place of enforced beauty, but also of intense confinement. You can't just leave. The gate is guarded, and the surrounding area is designed to prevent escape. It's a gilded cage, beautiful on the surface, but a prison nonetheless. Historians still argue whether the women within Yoshiwara had any true agency or if they were simply victims of circumstance and the system. There were certainly instances of women buying their freedom, but these were rare exceptions, not the norm. You learn the language of the district, the specific customs, the intricate rules of etiquette between ranks, and between courtesans and clients. It's a steep learning curve, and mistakes are not tolerated lightly. You see the younger girls, the kamuro, who serve the high-ranking courtesans, beginning their training early, their fates sealed from a tender age. It's a system that consumes youth and beauty, constantly needing new faces to replace those who age, fall ill, or somehow manage to leave. The air here is always charged, a mix of excitement and tension. By day, it's a place of rigorous training and preparation. By night, it transforms into a glittering, artificial paradise. The lanterns are lit, casting a warm, inviting glow that belies the cold reality of the transactions taking place. You might catch a glimpse of a high-ranking courtesan making her elaborate procession, oiring dochu down the main street, surrounded by her entourage, a spectacle designed to reinforce her status and allure. It's like watching a parade, but the floats are people whose lives are on display. The rules aren't just about behavior, they extend to every aspect of life. For instance, there were strict regulations on how courtesans could interact with people from outside the district, even family members, often requiring supervision. And forget about casual strolls outside the walls. That just didn't happen unless you were leaving for good, which was a monumental undertaking. It's a life lived entirely within these prescribed boundaries, physically and socially. It's a bit like being stuck in a very beautiful, very strict resort that you can never check out of. You quickly understand that your body, your time, and your skills are not your own. They belong to the house, to the madam who runs it, and ultimately, to the clients who pay for your company. This initial immersion is overwhelming, confusing, and terrifying. The beauty of the surroundings is a thin veil over the harsh economic realities and the lack of personal freedom that define life here. You've entered the floating world, and you're about to discover just how precarious it is to stay afloat. You're still reeling from the shock of arrival, the beautiful facade of the Nakamachi street fading as you're led deeper into the house. Now, the reality of the hierarchy hits you like a cold wave. It's not enough to just be here. You have to understand where you fit, and more importantly, where everyone else does. This isn't some free-for-all. It's a meticulously structured system, almost like a corporate ladder, but with way more silk and dramatically higher stakes. At the very pinnacle, the celebrities of this enclosed world were the Tai or Oiran. These women weren't just beautiful. They were expected to be masters of the arts, poetry, calligraphy, music, especially the shamisen, conversation, and the elaborate tea ceremony. Meeting one was incredibly expensive and involved multiple visits before intimacy was even on the table. It was more about intellectual and artistic courtship than anything else, a performance of elite culture. Below the Oiran were the Koshi, still highly ranked and skilled, but slightly more accessible. Then came various other levels, each with their own price points, privileges, or lack thereof, and expected skill sets. The lower you went down the ranks, the less emphasis was placed on the arts and conversation, and the more the focus shifted purely to physical services. At the bottom were the Hashijoro or Zashikimachi, whose lives were often the harshest, dealing with the most clients for the least reward, living in cramped, less luxurious quarters within the houses. You quickly learn that the house you're in dictates the highest rank you can aspire to. A small, low-tier house wouldn't have an Oiran, just like a corner store doesn't stock caviar. Your own rank, initially, is non-existent. You start as a shinzo, an apprentice, or even a kamuro if you were brought in very young, serving the higher-ranking women. Your days are filled with chores, lessons, and observing the complex social dance of the house. You learn how to walk in towering ghetto without face planting, a surprisingly difficult skill, trust me, how to apply the thick white makeup and elaborate hairstyles, and how to perform the various arts expected at your potential future rank. It's a relentless training regimen, designed to mold you into a marketable commodity. There's no slacking off, every minute is an investment by the house, and they expect a return. The rules governing life here are incredibly strict, bordering on the bizarre from an outside perspective. Everything is regulated. There are rules about when you can eat, sleep, bathe, who you can speak to, how you must address people of different ranks, and even the specific gestures and language you must use. For example, the the formal language used by high-ranking courtesans was distinct and complex, another barrier separating them from the lower ranks and the outside world. It was a form of cultural capital, only accessible through rigorous training. You couldn't just slouch or speak casually. Every movement, every word, was part of the performance, even when clients weren't around. It's like living in a perpetual historical reenactment society, but the stakes are your freedom and livelihood. One of the most significant rules was the absolute prohibition on leaving the district without express permission, which was incredibly rare and usually only granted for specific, supervised events like a pilgrimage or a visit to a dying relative, and even then, often with escorts. The omen gate you passed through wasn't just decorative, it was a physical and symbolic barrier. Trying to sneak out was met with severe punishment if caught. This wasn't just about control. It was also about maintaining the illusion of the floating world as a separate reality, detached from the mundane troubles of Edo. It's the ultimate gated community, except the gates keep you in. There were also rules about interactions within the district. Courtesans from different houses were often discouraged from socializing too freely, ostensibly to prevent gossip or collaboration, but also to maintain competition. Historians still argue whether these rules were primarily for control by the authorities and house owners, or if they also created a strange sense of community and shared identity among the women who lived under them. You certainly felt the weight of them every day, the constant pressure to conform and obey. Even relationships with clients had rules. A high-ranking Oiran, for instance, could refuse a client she disliked, a small but significant measure of agency in a life with very little. Lower-ranking women rarely had this luxury. There were also rules about how clients should behave, though these were often enforced less rigorously than the rules for the women. A samurai might have to leave his swords at the gate, but his wealth or status often afforded him a certain leniency inside. It was a system built on rules, yes, but also on power dynamics that often bent those rules for the privileged. Your days, once you moved past the initial shock, become a monotonous cycle of training and preparation. Waking before dawn, practicing music until your fingers ache, writing calligraphy until your wrist protests, learning the complex etiquette of serving tea, and endlessly practicing the elaborate hair and makeup routines. It takes hours to transform into the expected image, piling on the heavy silks and countless hairpins. It's a job that demands constant performance, both on stage, so to speak, and off. And underneath the heavy makeup and expensive robes, you're acutely aware of the debt you're accumulating, for your food, lodging, clothing, and training. That debt is another invisible chain, binding you tighter to this life, making escape seem increasingly impossible. It's like signing up for a fancy gym membership, but the monthly fees keep going up, and the only way to pay is by working out constantly, forever. The strict rules and the crushing debt work hand in hand, creating a system of control that is incredibly difficult to break free from. You're a product now, remember? And like any product, you need packaging. Beautiful, elaborate, slightly uncomfortable packaging. You quickly learn that becoming a courtesan isn't just about acquiring skills like music and poetry. It's about undergoing a physical transformation, a daily ritual of becoming someone else, someone designed to fit the floating world fantasy. And this transformation comes at a literal, and often painful, price. Your days aren't just filled with lessons, they're filled with the arduous process of crafting the required appearance. The first thing you encounter is the makeup. Forget a quick swipe of blush and some mascara. This is an art form, requiring hours of painstaking application. The base is a thick white paste, historically made from rice powder mixed with water or oil, but often, especially in later periods, containing lead. Yes, lead. You paint this onto your face, neck, and upper back, creating a stark, mask-like pallor that was the height of beauty at the time. It's heavy, it feels strange, and you quickly realize it clogs your pores like nothing else you've ever experienced. On top of this white canvas, you apply vibrant red around your eyes and to your lips, shaping them into a small, delicate bow. Sometimes green or black is used to subtly enhance the eyes or trace the hairline. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of lead-based makeup contributed significantly to the health problems and relatively short lifespans of women in the Yoshiwara. It certainly wasn't doing anyone any favors in the long run. Then comes the hair. Oh, the hair. Your natural hair is augmented with false pieces, built up into elaborate, gravity-defying structures. These aren't simple buns. They're complex sculptures, reflecting your rank and the current fashion. They require specific frames and countless heavy pins made of metal, sometimes adorned with coral, tortoiseshell, or even gold. These hairstyles could weigh several pounds, causing constant tension on your neck and scalp. Sleeping becomes a challenge. You have to rest your neck on a raised wooden block or a special pillow to avoid ruining the intricate structure. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep with what feels like a small, very heavy birdcage perched on your head. It's less beauty sleep and more minor chiropractic adjustment required sleep. Your eyebrows are also part of the ritual. For higher-ranking courtesans, it was common to shave the natural eyebrows and redraw them higher on the forehead, creating a distinctive, almost ethereal look. This wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was a nod to traditional practices where married women would shave their eyebrows after having their first child, but in the Yoshiwara, it became another marker of status and artifice. It's a quirky tidbit that highlights how the district often borrowed and transformed customs from the outside world for its own unique culture. Dressing is another ordeal. Layers upon layers of silk kimonos, often incredibly heavy and expensive, are carefully arranged. The obi, the wide sash worn around the waist, is tied in elaborate knots, often in the front, signifying your profession. Married women tied it in the back. This isn't just decorative. A tightly tied obi restricts movement, forcing you to walk with small, shuffling steps. It's a physical constraint that becomes part of the graceful, controlled performance expected of you. Getting dressed is a team effort, requiring the help of attendants to manage the weight and complexity of the garments. It's like getting ready for a red carpet event every single night, but with less champagne and more existential dread. Beyond the daily application of makeup and dressing, there were other practices, some less visible but equally demanding. Maintaining smooth, hairless skin was desired, leading to painful methods of epilation. Your hands and feet also required constant care, as they would be visible to clients. Even your teeth might eventually be considered part of the aesthetic transformation, although the infamous practice of ohaguro, or teeth blackening, was more commonly associated with married women outside the Yoshiwara and was often something courtesans might only do upon retirement or leaving the profession, rather than being a standard daily requirement for all ranks. The focus for most active courtesans was on keeping teeth clean and breath fresh, often using various powders and rinses. The sheer amount of time and effort poured into this daily transformation is staggering. You spend hours each morning preparing, hours each night performing while encased in this heavy, restrictive costume, and then more time carefully removing the makeup and hairpieces. It's a constant cycle, a performance that never truly ends, because even in your downtime within the house, you are expected to maintain a certain demeanor and appearance depending on your rank. The beauty you present to the world is a carefully constructed illusion, built on a foundation of discipline, discomfort, and potentially harmful substances. This elaborate presentation wasn't just about looking pretty, it was a crucial part of the product. The more beautiful, refined, and perfectly presented you were, the higher your rank, the more you could charge, and potentially, the faster you could earn enough to pay off your debt. Your body and its adornment were your primary assets, and maintaining them was a full-time job in itself, layered on top of all the other demands of your life. It's a painful price to pay for beauty, especially when that beauty isn't truly for you, but for the market you inhabit. The weight of the hair, the tightness of the obi, the feeling of the lead paint on your skin, these are constant physical reminders that your body is not entirely your own. You've spent hours encased in the heavy makeup, the elaborate hair structure pulling at your scalp, the layers of silk weighing you down. Your body feels like a walking art installation, beautiful but stiff. But the transformation isn't just physical, it's mental. You have to shift gears from the quiet discipline of training to the vibrant, demanding energy of the night. Your day isn't over, it's just entering its most crucial, and often most exhausting, phase. The daytime hours, once the beauty ritual is complete, are dedicated to relentless preparation. Think of it as going to a very intense, very specific boarding school where your grades are measured in client satisfaction and potential earnings. Your curriculum is vast and demanding. Music is central. The haunting, plucky sound of the shamisen is the soundtrack to the Yoshiwara, and you must become proficient, if not a master. Your fingers ache from pressing the strings, the same simple melodies practiced over and over until they become second nature. Calligraphy and poetry aren't just hobbies, they're tools of the trade. You learn to write elegant verses, compose witty haiku, and discuss classical literature with clients who often pride themselves on their own cultural knowledge. It's not enough to be beautiful, you have to be engaging, educated, and able to hold your own in sophisticated conversation. Etiquette is another massive subject. The rules of interaction are incredibly nuanced, varying depending on your rank and the client's status. You learn the formal language, the specific bowing postures, the appropriate way to serve tea, another skill required at higher ranks. It's a constant performance, even during lessons, observed and critiqued by older courtesans and the house madam. There's no room for error. A single slip in etiquette could reflect poorly on the house and cost you dearly. You might even be expected to learn traditional dance, adding another layer of physical discipline to your already packed schedule. It's like trying to get multiple PhDs simultaneously, but you also have to look stunning while doing it. The younger girls, the kamuro, flit around, running errands, helping with chores, fanning the higher-ranking women, and observing everything. They are the next generation, starting their training early, their innocent faces sometimes peeking out from under elaborate children's hairstyles, already marked by the system. It's a quirky tidbit how even the youngest were integrated into the structure, their play often mimicking the adult world they would soon inhabit. You remember being one of them, watching in awe and terror. As dusk falls, the atmosphere in the house begins to change. The daytime quiet of lessons and chores gives way to a rising hum of anticipation. Attendants rush about, lighting lanterns, preparing the rooms, arranging flowers. The air fills with the scent of incense and expensive perfumes. It's showtime. You are led to the designated waiting rooms, beautifully decorated spaces where clients would be introduced. Depending on your rank, this might be a grand, public hall or a smaller, more private room. This is where the performance truly begins. You sit, perfectly composed, your face a serene mask under the heavy makeup, your elaborate hair a crown. Clients arrive, often introduced by house staff or their own attendants. The initial interaction is formal, a dance of polite conversation and observation. For higher-ranking courtesans like the Orin or Tayu, this first meeting might be purely conversational, a chance for the client to gauge her wit and charm before deciding to pursue further visits. It's less about immediate physical intimacy and more about purchasing time, conversation, and the prestige of being in the presence of a celebrated figure. Think of it as a very expensive, very formal first date where the bill for appetizers alone could bankrupt a small village. Lower down the ranks, the process is often much faster and less focused on intellectual or artistic pursuits. The interactions are more direct, the expectations clearer. You might see multiple clients in a single night, the turnover rapid and relentless. There's little time for polite conversation or a poetry recitation, the focus is purely transactional. The physical and emotional toll this takes is immense, a stark contrast to the refined image the Yoshiwara tried to project. The nights are long. You might be expected to entertain clients until the early hours of the morning, engaging in conversation, playing music, singing songs, pouring sake, and maintaining the illusion of pleasure and engagement regardless of how tired or unwell you feel. The mask of composure must never slip. You are constantly on, performing the role you were trained for, your body and mind pushed to their limits. Sleep comes in short, often interrupted bursts before the morning ritual begins again. Historians still argue whether the courtesans, particularly the high-ranking ones, saw themselves primarily as artists forced into prostitution or as sex workers who used artistic skills to elevate their status and price. There's no single answer, and the reality likely varied greatly from woman to woman, depending on her background, personality, and the specific house she belonged to. But regardless of how they perceived themselves, the daily reality was one of intense labor, both physical and emotional. The constant pressure to perform, to be beautiful, witty, and compliant, was exhausting. And all of this, every conversation, every song, every painful step in towering Geta, seriously, just walking in those things for hours is a workout, was ultimately in service of chipping away at the mountain of debt that loomed over you. It's a debt paid not just with money, but with your time, your energy, and your very essence, day in and day out. The glittering spectacle of the nakamachi, the elaborate kimonos, the perfectly painted faces, it's all a performance, a beautiful lie. And like any lie, it hides an ugliness beneath the surface. For all the art and culture, the Yoshiwara was also a place where disease and despair were constant, unwelcome companions. The very conditions designed to create the floating world illusion also created a breeding ground for illness, both physical and mental. You quickly learn that staying healthy is a luxury you probably can't afford. The houses, even the grander ones, were often crowded. Privacy was minimal, and sanitation, by modern standards, was rudimentary. Imagine living in close quarters with dozens, maybe hundreds, of other people, sharing facilities, with limited access to fresh air and sunlight in some areas. It's a recipe for germs to spread like wildfire. A simple cold could sweep through a house, and something more serious could be devastating. You try to eat what you can, but the diet provided by the house might not always be the most nutritious, focused more on filling you up cheaply than providing sustained health. And then there's the sheer exhaustion. Remember the grueling training, the hours spent in heavy makeup and clothes, the long nights entertaining clients until dawn. Sleep is a scarce commodity, often interrupted and rarely restful, especially when you have to balance your head on a wooden block to protect your elaborate hairstyle. Chronic sleep deprivation weakens the immune system, making you more vulnerable to every sniffle and cough that goes around. It's like being in a perpetual state of jet lag, but instead of getting to enjoy a foreign country, you just get sicker. Beyond the common ailments, a far more insidious threat lurked in the background: sexually transmitted infections. Syphilis, known then by various names, was particularly rampant and devastating. It was a terrifying reality of the profession, a constant risk with every client. There was limited understanding of how these diseases spread or how to effectively treat them. While some herbal remedies or mercury-based treatments, which were often as dangerous as the disease itself, were available, they were rarely curative and often came with severe side effects. Catching such a disease wasn't just a health crisis, it was an economic one. An ill courtesan couldn't work, and inability to work meant inability to earn, which meant the debt mountain just grew taller, faster. It was a vicious cycle. The sicker you got, the deeper in debt you fell, and the deeper in debt you fell, the harder it was to get the rest and care you needed to recover. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of the tragically short life expectancy for many Yoshiwara women was the prevalence of STIs or the cumulative toll of overwork, poor nutrition, stress, and other infectious diseases. It's likely a grim combination of all these factors, a perfect storm of hardship. When you did get sick, especially if it was something contagious or visibly debilitating, you might be sequestered away. There wasn't a dedicated hospital in the Yoshiwara for the women. Care was often provided within the houses, if at all, by house staff with limited medical knowledge or by visiting practitioners who might offer questionable remedies. Concealing illness was often necessary, at least in the early stages, because appearing unwell meant losing potential clients and incurring the madam's displeasure. You learned to plaster a smile on your face, despite fever or pain, to push through the nausea or the ache in your bones. It was another layer of performance, pretending to be healthy and vibrant even when your body was failing you. Some turned to folk remedies or traditional practices, a quirky tidbit of their desperation. Everything from herbal concoctions and acupuncture to seemingly bizarre treatments or reliance on charms and prayers was tried in the hope of alleviating symptoms or warding off illness. Imagine trying to cure syphilis with boiled herbs and a lucky cat charm. It highlights the limited medical options available and the reliance on superstition in the face of such pervasive threats. It wasn't exactly cutting-edge medicine, more like throwing darts at a wall hoping one sticks. The despair wasn't just a result of physical illness, it was also the constant emotional toll of the life. The lack of freedom, the transactional nature of relationships, the crushing debt, the separation from family, the loss of personal identity, all these weighed heavily on the mind. Depression, anxiety, and feelings of hopelessness were undoubtedly common, though not recognized as such in the medical understanding of the time. There was no therapy available, no mental health support. You were expected to maintain composure, to be cheerful and entertaining, regardless of your internal state. The pressure to constantly perform happiness when you felt anything but was exhausting and isolating. Some women found solace in friendships with other courtesans, bonding over shared hardships, a brief respite of genuine human connection in a world built on artifice. Others might cling to the hope of a client falling in love and buying their freedom, or the distant possibility of earning enough to leave on their own. But these were rare exceptions, fragile glimmers in the pervasive darkness. The reality for most was a life lived under the shadow of illness and despair, a constant battle against forces that seemed determined to wear you down, both physically and emotionally. The beautiful facade of the Yoshiwara, the silk and the music and the laughter, often hid coughing fits, feverish sweats, and the quiet tears of women struggling to survive. Your body, already a commodity, was constantly under threat, and the emotional weight of the life was a heavy burden to bear. Staying afloat in the floating world required not just beauty and skill, but an almost superhuman level of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a world where even the air felt heavy with unspoken suffering, a stark contrast to the light-hearted entertainment it was designed to provide. You've pushed through the pain, the exhaustion, the constant worry about sickness. You've perfected the smile, the posture, the performance. Because despite the internal battle against illness and despair, the show must go on. And the show is for them, the clients. They are the reason this entire, elaborate, gilded cage exists. They are the source of the house's income, and theoretically, your eventual freedom. Stepping out of the training rooms and into the entertainment spaces, you encounter the men who populate your nights. Who were these clients? They were a diverse group, drawn from various levels of Edo society, though primarily those with disposable income. Wealthy merchants were perhaps the most common patrons, eager to flaunt their success and enjoy pleasures often unavailable to them in their more rigid social spheres. Samurai also frequented the district, though as you remember, they had to check their swords at the gate, a sensible rule considering the amount of alcohol and potentially volatile emotions in the air. Imagine the awkwardness if someone forgot that rule and things got heated. Oops, pardon me, just retrieving my katana from the cloakroom, be right back. You also saw artists, writers, and even some lower-ranking officials, all seeking escape, entertainment, and companionship, or just a temporary immersion in this carefully constructed fantasy world. For the high-ranking courtesans, the interaction with clients was less about immediate physical intimacy and more about a prolonged courtship, a performance of refined taste and intellectual connection. A client interested in an oiran or taya couldn't just pay and immediately spend the night. The process involved multiple visits, each progressively more expensive and formal. The first visit, known as shokai, first meeting, was purely conversational. The courtesan would sit in a place of honor, often accompanied by her young attendants, while the client and his entourage were introduced. It was a chance for the client to make an impression and for the courtesan to decide if she found him suitable company. She might ignore him entirely if she didn't, a subtle but powerful assertion of agency. If she accepted him, he would be invited back for a second visit, yurikai, reverse meeting, which was slightly more relaxed but still focused on conversation, food, drink, and entertainment like music or dance. Only after these preliminary visits, and if the courtesan agreed, would there be a third visit, sanmai, third time, where intimacy became a possibility. This multi-stage process wasn't just about exclusivity. It was designed to elevate the courtesan's status, portraying her as someone whose favor had to be earned, not simply bought. It also significantly increased the client's expenses, tying him more deeply to the house and the courtesan. It's kind of like online dating, but instead of swiping right, you had to endure 2 awkward, expensive dinner dates before even thinking about a kiss. For the lower-ranking courtesans, the interactions were far less elaborate and much more direct. There were no multi-visit courtships. Clients would select a woman, negotiate a price, and the transaction would be completed relatively quickly. The emphasis was on physical service rather than refined conversation or artistic performance. This meant a constant, rapid turnover of clients, with little time for rest or personal interaction. It was grueling work, physically and emotionally draining, a stark contrast to the leisurely, cultured environment portrayed in woodblock prints. The nature of the relationships formed here was, at its core, transactional. Money was the driving force. The clients paid for time, for company, for entertainment, and for physical intimacy. The courtesans provided these services to earn money for the house and chip away at their debt. However, the human element couldn't be entirely erased. Despite the artificiality, genuine connections sometimes formed. Some clients became regulars, developing a rapport with a particular courtesan. They might share stories, confide in each other, or even develop feelings that went beyond the contractual exchange. These relationships were complex and often fraught with difficulty, as the power imbalance and the underlying economic reality were always present. A quirky tidbit about client interactions: some clients would adopt specific affectations or behaviors within the Yoshiwara, creating a persona distinct from their everyday life outside the gate. It was part of the immersive experience, shedding the constraints of their normal social roles to fully inhabit the floating world fantasy. They might use a different name, affect a different manner of speech, or engage in behaviors they wouldn't dare outside the district. It was like a historical cosplay convention, but with much higher stakes and significantly more potential for STIs. The house rules didn't just apply to the courtesans. Clients also had expectations placed upon them, though enforcement could be inconsistent. As mentioned, swords had to be left at the gate. There were rules about decorum and behavior, although wealthy or influential clients might sometimes bend these rules without consequence. The house staff, including male attendants and managers, played a crucial role in managing the interactions, ensuring rules were followed, mostly by the courtesans, collecting payment, and maintaining order. A mainstream historical fact is the sheer economic scale of the Yoshiwara. It was a major economic engine in Edo, generating significant revenue for the house owners and contributing to the city's vibrant, if morally ambiguous, economy. The money flowed from the clients through the houses and into the broader Edo marketplace, supporting countless ancillary businesses, from kimono makers and hairdressers to sake brewers and food vendors. It was a whole ecosystem built around this one district. Despite the transactional nature, stories abound of clients falling deeply in love with courtesans, sometimes leading to dramatic attempts to buy their freedom, or even tragic double suicides, *Shinju*, when escape seemed impossible. These romanticized tales, immortalized in plays and literature, highlight the human desire for connection even within a system designed to commodify it. Historians still argue whether these tales of true love were representative of common experiences or rare, often embellished exceptions that serve to romanticize a harsh reality. The truth is likely somewhere in between, with fleeting moments of genuine feeling existing alongside the pervasive economic exchange. You sit there, night after night, observing the parade of faces, listening to their stories, performing your role. You learn to read their moods, anticipate their desires, and maintain your composure no matter what is said or done. You are a mirror, reflecting back whatever the client wants to see, a cultured companion, a sympathetic listener, a source of physical pleasure. Each interaction is a negotiation, not just of price, but of emotional energy. And with each client, the mountain of debt you owe either shrinks by a minuscule amount or, if they are difficult or cheap, barely budges, leaving you feeling even more trapped. The clients are your lifeline, but they are also a constant reminder of your bondage. You've pushed through the pain, the exhaustion, the constant worry about sickness. You've perfected the smile, the posture, the performance. Because despite the internal battle against illness and despair, the show must go on. And the show is for them, the clients. They are the reason this entire, elaborate, gilded cage exists. They are the source of the house's income, and theoretically, your eventual freedom. Stepping out of the training rooms and into the entertainment spaces, you encounter the men who populate your nights. Who were these clients? They were a diverse group, drawn from various levels of Edo society, though primarily those with disposable income. Wealthy merchants were perhaps the most common patrons, eager to flaunt their success and enjoy pleasures often unavailable to them in their more rigid social spheres. Samurai also frequented the district, though as you remember, they had to check their swords at the gate, a sensible rule considering the amount of alcohol and potentially volatile emotions in the air. Imagine the awkwardness if someone forgot that rule and things got heated. Oops, pardon me, just retrieving my katana from the cloakroom, be right back. You also saw artists, writers, and even some lower-ranking officials, all seeking escape, entertainment, and companionship, or just a temporary immersion in this carefully constructed fantasy world. For the high-ranking courtesans, the interaction with clients was less about immediate physical intimacy and more about a prolonged courtship, a performance of refined taste and intellectual connection. A client interested in an oiran or taya couldn't just pay and immediately spend the night. The process involved multiple visits, each progressively more expensive and formal. The first visit, known as shokai, first meeting, was purely conversational. The courtesan would sit in a place of honor, often accompanied by her young attendants, while the client and his entourage were introduced. It was a chance for the client to make an impression and for the courtesan to decide if she found him suitable company. She might ignore him entirely if she didn't, a subtle but powerful assertion of agency. If she accepted him, he would be invited back for a second visit, yurikai, reverse meeting, which was slightly more relaxed but still focused on conversation, food, drink, and entertainment like music or dance. Only after these preliminary visits, and if the courtesan agreed, would there be a third visit, sanmai, third time, where intimacy became a possibility. This multi-stage process wasn't just about exclusivity. It was designed to elevate the courtesan's status, portraying her as someone whose favor had to be earned, not simply bought. It also significantly increased the client's expenses, tying him more deeply to the house and the courtesan. It's kind of like online dating, but instead of swiping right, you had to endure 2 awkward, expensive dinner dates before even thinking about a kiss. For the lower-ranking courtesans, the interactions were far less elaborate and much more direct. There were no multi-visit courtships. Clients would select a woman, negotiate a price, and the transaction would be completed relatively quickly. The emphasis was on physical service rather than refined conversation or artistic performance. This meant a constant, rapid turnover of clients, with little time for rest or personal interaction. It was grueling work, physically and emotionally draining, a stark contrast to the leisurely, cultured environment portrayed in woodblock prints. The nature of the relationships formed here was, at its core, transactional. Money was the driving force. The clients paid for time, for company, for entertainment, and for physical intimacy. The courtesans provided these services to earn money for the house and chip away at their debt. However, the human element couldn't be entirely erased. Despite the artificiality, genuine connections sometimes formed. Some clients became regulars, developing a rapport with a particular courtesan. They might share stories, confide in each other, or even develop feelings that went beyond the contractual exchange. These relationships were complex and often fraught with difficulty, as the power imbalance and the underlying economic reality were always present. A quirky tidbit about client interactions: some clients would adopt specific affectations or behaviors within the Yoshiwara, creating a persona distinct from their everyday life outside the gate. It was part of the immersive experience, shedding the constraints of their normal social roles to fully inhabit the floating world fantasy. They might use a different name, affect a different manner of speech, or engage in behaviors they wouldn't dare outside the district. It was like a historical cosplay convention, but with much higher stakes and significantly more potential for STIs. The house rules didn't just apply to the courtesans. Clients also had expectations placed upon them, though enforcement could be inconsistent. As mentioned, swords had to be left at the gate. There were rules about decorum and behavior, although wealthy or influential clients might sometimes bend these rules without consequence. The house staff, including male attendants and managers, played a crucial role in managing the interactions, ensuring rules were followed, mostly by the courtesans, collecting payment, and maintaining order. A mainstream historical fact is the sheer economic scale of the Yoshiwara. It was a major economic engine in Edo, generating significant revenue for the house owners and contributing to the city's vibrant, if morally ambiguous, economy. The money flowed from the clients through the houses and into the broader Edo marketplace, supporting countless ancillary businesses, from kimono makers and hairdressers to sake brewers and food vendors. It was a whole ecosystem built around this one district. Despite the transactional nature, stories abound of clients falling deeply in love with courtesans, sometimes leading to dramatic attempts to buy their freedom, or even tragic double suicides, *Shinju*, when escape seemed impossible. These romanticized tales, immortalized in plays and literature, highlight the human desire for connection even within a system designed to commodify it. Historians still argue whether these tales of true love were representative of common experiences or rare, often embellished exceptions that serve to romanticize a harsh reality. The truth is likely somewhere in between, with fleeting moments of genuine feeling existing alongside the pervasive economic exchange. You sit there, night after night, observing the parade of faces, listening to their stories, performing your role. You learn to read their moods, anticipate their desires, and maintain your composure no matter what is said or done. You are a mirror, reflecting back whatever the client wants to see, a cultured companion, a sympathetic listener, a source of physical pleasure. Each interaction is a negotiation, not just of price, but of emotional energy. And with each client, the mountain of debt you owe either shrinks by a minuscule amount or, if they are difficult or cheap, barely budges, leaving you feeling even more trapped. The clients are your lifeline, but they are also a constant reminder of your bondage. That feeling of being trapped, that constant pressure lurking beneath the gilded surface. It has a name, and it's a heavy one: debt. When you were brought here, your family, or whoever sold you, received a sum of money. That money wasn't a payment for you, it was an advance against your future earnings. You didn't just arrive, you arrived with a price tag attached, a negative balance in your ledger from day one. Think of it as starting your new job with a bill for your relocation expenses and your first year's salary already spent. And that initial debt was just the beginning. Remember all that elaborate makeup you put on? The thick white paste, the vibrant red, the hours spent applying it? That costs money. The heavy kimonos, layer upon layer of silk, intricately patterned? Incredibly expensive. The elaborate hair structures, requiring false pieces and countless heavy pins? More expense. The food you eat, the small space you sleep in, the lessons you receive, music, calligraphy, dance, etiquette, all of it is tallied up, meticulously recorded by the house staff, and added to your debt. Every single expense, from a new set of hairpins to the candles used in your room, from the tea you served to a client to a doctor's visit, if you even got one for something serious, was added to your growing tab. It was like living in a hotel where everything, absolutely everything, was minibar priced and charged directly to your room, except your room was also your prison, and you had to work constantly just to afford the air you breathed. Your earnings from clients didn't go directly to you. Oh no. They went straight to the house, madam. A significant portion was taken for the house's profit. After all, they owned the building, paid the staff, and took the risks, though arguably, you were taking the biggest risks. Another portion went towards your current expenses, that day's food, heating fuel, replacement makeup. And only a tiny, often negligible, amount, if anything, was left after expenses and the house's cut, was applied to your mountain of accumulated debt. It was a system designed to keep you perpetually in the red. The cost of living and working in the Yoshiwara was deliberately high for the courtesans, ensuring that their expenses often outpaced their meager portion of the earnings. A mainstream historical fact about this system is that the contracts were often for fixed terms, sometimes as long as 10 to 15 years. But the debt structure made it highly unlikely that a woman could pay off her debt within that term through her own earnings alone. This effectively extended her bondage indefinitely unless she was bought out by a wealthy client, or her family somehow managed to scrape together the funds, which was incredibly rare. The original contract length became almost irrelevant when the debt kept you tied there regardless. Illness was a particularly cruel way the debt could increase. If you were too sick to work, you weren't earning anything for the house, and therefore nothing was applied to your debt. But your expenses, food, lodging, medical care, however inadequate, continued to accrue. So, while you were lying there, feverish and weak, perhaps suffering from one of the rampant diseases of the district, your debt was silently growing taller. It was a trap with no easy way out. You were literally paying for the privilege of being too sick to work. Historians still argue whether the debt was primarily a genuine reflection of the considerable costs of running a high-end establishment and training women, or if it was a deliberately inflated and manipulated tool used by house owners to maintain control and maximize profit by preventing women from ever truly earning their freedom. Given the opaque accounting practices and the consistent outcome of perpetual indebtedness for most women, it's hard not to lean towards the latter as a significant factor. Imagine waking up every day knowing that no matter how hard you work, how many clients you see, how charming and skilled you are, how much you earn for the house, the number you owe is probably going up, or at best, inching down at a snail's pace. It's soul-crushing. This wasn't just financial bondage. It was psychological warfare. The debt was an invisible chain, heavier than any physical restraint, binding you to the house and the life within the walls. It dictated your present and stole your future. There were even more insidious ways the debt could grow. Fines for minor infractions of the strict rules, remember those, were added to your debt. If a client broke something expensive, or if there was any damage during an interaction, the cost might be added to your tab. Sometimes, even gifts given by clients were accounted for in a way that ultimately added to the courtesan's debt, or the cost of entertaining a specific client was billed back to her account beyond the standard fee. A quirky tidbit is that the debt records were often kept in large, imposing ledgers, sometimes displayed or referenced in a way that reinforced the constant, visible burden hanging over the women. The sight of the madam or her manager consulting these ledgers could send a shiver of fear down your spine. It was a constant, tangible representation of your captivity. The weight of the debt was a constant companion, heavier than the most elaborate kimono, more suffocating than the tightest obi. It was the engine that drove everything in the Yoshiwara, the reason for the relentless training, the demanding performances, the constant pressure to be beautiful and desirable. Your body and your labor were simply tools to service this ever-growing financial obligation. And the knowledge that freedom was a number that kept receding into the distance, rather than getting closer, was a heavy burden to carry, day in and day out. You feel the weight of that ledger entry like a physical burden, the numbers on the page dictating the boundaries of your world. The debt is a constant, suffocating presence, heavier than the most elaborate hairstyle, tighter than the most restrictive obi. It's the invisible wall within the already walled district. Yet, even in this system built on transaction and control, where every interaction has a price tag, the human heart sometimes refuses to follow the rules of commerce. Amidst the artifice, the performance, and the crushing reality of financial bondage, were there ever glimmers of genuine connection, moments of love, or fragile sparks of hope? The official narrative of the Yoshiwara presented the courtesans as refined entertainers and companions, and the clients as cultured patrons seeking sophisticated pleasure. This carefully crafted image, promoted in woodblock prints and popular stories, often romanticized the relationships formed within the district, portraying them as passionate affairs, sometimes leading to dramatic, tragic ends. And while these portrayals were often idealized, they weren't entirely without foundation. Despite the transactional nature, genuine feelings did occasionally develop between courtesans and their clients. For the high-ranking courtesans, the multi-visit courtship process, remember that awkward, expensive, first date, that had to happen twice before intimacy was even on the table? This process, while designed to increase exclusivity and cost, also created space for actual conversation and getting to know one another beyond the immediate transaction. A client might genuinely enjoy a courtesan's wit, her skill at the shamisen, her knowledge of poetry, or simply her company. And a courtesan, despite the power imbalance and the underlying economic reality, might find a client kind, interesting, or perhaps even genuinely appealing. These were moments where the mask could sometimes slip, allowing for a brief, fragile connection between the people underneath the roles. These relationships, when they did form, were fraught with difficulty. The rules of the Yoshiwara were designed to prevent courtesans from forming attachments that could interfere with their work or lead them to seek freedom outside the established system. Any sign of genuine affection could be viewed with suspicion by the house madam, who saw it as a potential threat to her investment. Clients who became too attached might be discouraged, or their visits made prohibitively expensive to test their commitment, or simply to extract more money. It was a cruel paradox. The more genuine the feeling, the more the system seemed to work to crush it. A quirky tidbit about these clandestine connections is that courtesans and clients sometimes develop secret ways to communicate or exchange small tokens of affection, like hidden notes tucked into sleeves, or specific patterns woven into fabrics that carried a personal meaning only they understood. These small acts of defiance against the pervasive control highlight the human need for intimacy and connection, finding ways to exist even within the most restrictive environments. It was like leaving secret messages in class, but if you got caught, the punishment involved adding another year to your sentence in debt. Hope, too, existed in various forms. The most obvious hope was earning or being bought out of the contract. While rare, stories of courtesans who managed to pay off their debt or were redeemed by a wealthy lover or family member circulated within the district, serving as powerful, if often unrealistic, symbols of possibility. These women might go on to marry, start a new life, or even open their own businesses outside the Yoshiwara walls. A mainstream historical fact is that some famous courtesans, particularly those of high rank who cultivated wealthy and influential patrons, did successfully navigate their way to freedom and went on to live independent lives, sometimes even becoming respected figures in Edo society. Their success, however, underscores just how difficult it was for the vast majority of women trapped by debt and circumstance. Another form of hope was finding solace and solidarity in friendships with other courtesans. Sharing the harsh realities of the life, the grueling training, the constant pressure, the fear of illness, remember the rampant STIs and harsh living conditions, the emotional exhaustion. This shared experience could forge deep bonds of understanding and support. These friendships, free from the transactional nature of client interactions, provided a crucial emotional lifeline for many women, a sense of belonging in a world designed to isolate them. They were sisters in arms, navigating the treacherous waters of the floating world together. And then there was the hope of simply surviving the day, pushing through the exhaustion, the fear, and the despair. The hope that tomorrow might be slightly better, that a kind client might visit, that the madam might be in a good mood, that you wouldn't fall ill. It was a more fundamental, day-to-day kind of hope, less about grand escape and more about enduring the present. Historians still argue whether these tales of true love were representative of common experiences or rare, often embellished exceptions that served to romanticize a harsh reality. While romantic dramas certainly focused on the passionate love affairs, the daily grind for most courtesans, particularly those in the lower ranks, was far less glamorous, dominated by debt, disease, and relentless work. Genuine connection was likely a precious, fragile thing, hard-won and constantly under threat from the system itself. The longing for connection, for something real amidst the performance, was undoubtedly a powerful force. You see it in the quiet moments between shifts, the hushed conversations with fellow courtesans, the small kindnesses exchanged. You might find yourself looking forward to a particular client's visit, not just for the money he brings, but for the brief respite from the performance, the chance to feel seen as a person, however fleetingly. But even these glimmers of hope and love were often overshadowed by the pervasive fear and the looming reality of the debt. A genuine connection could be shattered by the house's demands, by a client's inability to pay, by illness, or by the simple, inescapable fact that you were not free. Love didn't pay the bills, and it certainly didn't erase the ledger. It was a beautiful, dangerous distraction in a world that demanded you stay focused on the transaction. And perhaps the most terrifying fear of all, one that could extinguish any spark of hope, was the ever-present possibility of an unwanted pregnancy. You feel the weight of that ledger entry like a physical burden, the numbers on the page dictating the boundaries of your world. The debt is a constant, suffocating presence, heavier than the most elaborate hairstyle, tighter than the most restrictive obi. It's the invisible wall within the already walled district. Yet, even in this system built on transaction and control, where every interaction has a price tag, the human heart sometimes refuses to follow the rules of commerce. Amidst the artifice, the performance, and the crushing reality of financial bondage, were there ever glimmers of genuine connection, moments of love, or fragile sparks of hope? Perhaps fleetingly. But even those rare moments of light were constantly overshadowed by a much darker, more pervasive shadow, the ever-present, stomach-dropping fear of unwanted pregnancy. In a life where your body is your livelihood, where every day is a performance measured in yen and debt reduction, the possibility of carrying a child was not a joyous prospect. It was a potential catastrophe. Pregnancy meant inability to work, especially in the later stages. Inability to work meant no income flowing to the house, and therefore, no chipping away at that crushing debt. In fact, the debt would only continue to grow, adding the cost of your upkeep and any minimal care you might receive during your pregnancy. A pregnant courtesan was, from the house's perspective, a liability, a drain on resources. And for you, it was a direct threat to your already precarious existence and any distant hope of ever gaining freedom. The house rules, remember those incredibly strict, sometimes bizarre regulations governing every aspect of your life? They certainly didn't make allowances for motherhood. There was no maternity leave, no childcare provided by the establishment. A pregnancy was something to be avoided at all costs, a problem that needed to be dealt with swiftly and discreetly. This wasn't a world where children were welcomed, especially not the children born of a courtesan's profession. Social stigma outside the district was immense, and within the Yoshiwara walls, a child was simply an obstacle to the business model. The terrifying reality was that in Edo-era Japan, effective contraception as we know it simply didn't exist. A mainstream historical fact is that while people across different social strata practiced various methods to prevent conception, none were truly reliable by modern standards. This wasn't a problem unique to the Yoshiwara. It was a widespread challenge in a society without access to reliable birth control. But for the courtesans, the stakes were astronomically higher. For a woman outside the district, an unwanted pregnancy might be a social or economic hardship. For a woman within, it could be ruinous, even fatal. So, what methods were available, or at least attempted? The options were incredibly limited and often ineffective. One common method relied on by many across society was the withdrawal method, coitus interruptus. As you can probably guess, its success rate was, let's just say, not exactly confidence-inspiring. It required a degree of control and cooperation from the client that was far from guaranteed, especially after sake had been flowing freely. Relying on that felt less like planning and more like crossing your fingers and hoping for the best, which isn't exactly a solid life strategy. There might have been attempts at using primitive barrier methods, though evidence is scarce and descriptions vary. Some historical texts mention the use of animal bladders or pieces of oiled paper as coverings, but these were likely uncomfortable, unreliable, and probably not widely available or consistently used, especially in the fast-paced, demanding environment of a lower-ranking courtesan's night. Imagine trying to discreetly prepare one of those things between clients. It adds a whole new layer of awkwardness to an already difficult job. Folk remedies and traditional beliefs also played a role, though again, effectiveness was questionable at best. Some might have ingested certain herbs or concoctions believed to have contraceptive properties, though the knowledge was often based on superstition rather than science, and some substances could be harmful. A quirky tidbit is the belief in certain amulets or charms that could ward off pregnancy, sometimes worn discreetly or kept hidden. Relying on a lucky charm to prevent a life-altering event highlights the sheer desperation and lack of viable options available. It's like trying to stop a train with a piece of string. The burden of prevention, despite the methods requiring client cooperation, often fell disproportionately on the courtesans. It was their livelihood, their body, and their debt that were most directly impacted by a pregnancy. Historians still argue whether courtesans, particularly high-ranking ones, had any significant ability to negotiate with clients about contraception, or if they were largely at the mercy of the client's willingness and the house's priorities. While a high-ranking Oiran might have had slightly more leverage due to her status and the multi-visit process, the vast majority of women had very little power to dictate terms or ensure safe practices. Their primary focus was on satisfying the client and earning money, which often meant accepting whatever risks came with the interaction. The constant anxiety must have been immense. Every month, the dread leading up to your cycle, praying for its arrival. Every late period, a wave of cold fear washing over you, followed by frantic, whispered conversations with other women, comparing symptoms, sharing ineffective remedies, offering hollow reassurances. It was a silent, shared terror that bound you together, another layer of hardship on top of the debt, the illness, and the exhaustion. You were constantly walking on eggshells, not just with clients and a madam, but with your own body, hoping it wouldn't betray you. This fear wasn't just about the immediate problem of pregnancy. It was about the domino effect it would have on your life. Remember the crushing debt? A pregnancy would make paying that off virtually impossible. Remember the harsh living conditions and the constant threat of disease? Being pregnant and unable to work would only expose you to more hardship and less care. Remember the dream, however faint, of one day gaining freedom? A pregnancy could extinguish that hope entirely. It was a stark reminder of the lack of control you had over your own life and your own body, a vulnerability inherent in the system you were trapped within. The constant worry was a heavy, invisible weight you carried every single day, heavier than any kimono, more suffocating than any obi. It was the dark underside of the floating world, a stark reminder that beneath the glittering surface, life was incredibly fragile and dangerous. And if prevention failed, the next steps were even more terrifying. That fear, that cold dread you felt at the end of Section 9, the fear of the impossible happening, the dreaded pregnancy? It wasn't just a passive anxiety, it drove desperate action. Because while effective birth control was a concept that belonged firmly in the distant future, the women in the Yoshiwara, and indeed people across Edo-era Japan, weren't entirely without methods they hoped would prevent conception. The key word here is hoped. These weren't reliable, scientifically proven techniques. They were ancient methods, folk practices, and desperate attempts born of necessity and a profound lack of better options. You, living this life, would quickly become acquainted with the whispered advice, the questionable remedies, and the sheer unreliability of it all. Remember, your body wasn't entirely your own. It was a tool for earning, a commodity tied to debt. A pregnancy would halt that earning, inflate that debt, and potentially ruin any chance of freedom. The stakes were impossibly high. So you listened, you tried, you hoped. One of the most common, and perhaps the most widely attempted method across all social classes in this era, was withdrawal, or coitus interruptus. This involved the male partner attempting to withdraw before ejaculation. Now, let's be brutally honest here, relying on the timing and control of a client, often under the influence of sake and caught up in the moment, for something so crucial? That's less a reliable contraceptive strategy, and more like betting your life savings on a coin flip where the coin is slightly weighted against you. The success rate was notoriously low, and its effectiveness depended entirely on the client's willingness, self-control, and frankly, sobriety, 3 things not always guaranteed in the Yoshiwara. You might try to encourage it, subtly or directly, but ultimately, the control was out of your hands, a terrifying vulnerability. Beyond withdrawal, the options became even more rudimentary and often, frankly, uncomfortable or potentially harmful. Some historical accounts and later writings suggest attempts at using primitive barrier methods. Imagine trying to fashion something usable out of animal bladders or thin pieces of oiled paper. Even if you could acquire such materials and somehow make them work, their effectiveness would have been minimal. They were likely ill-fitting, easily damaged, and certainly not a reliable barrier against microscopic sperm. Plus, the logistics of discreetly preparing and using such a device in the context of a client interaction, especially for lower-ranking women with little privacy or time, adds a whole new layer of difficulty and awkwardness. It's like trying to wrap a present beautifully in a hurricane using only sellotape, and a single sheet of tissue paper. Not ideal. Folk remedies and traditional beliefs were also heavily relied upon, often out of sheer desperation. The knowledge of these methods was passed down through whispered conversations between women, a grim form of shared survival strategy. These included various herbal concoctions, teas, or pessaries, substances inserted vaginally, that were believed to prevent conception or induce menstruation if a period was late. The ingredients varied widely, from common herbs to more obscure or even toxic substances. The understanding of how these worked, if they worked at all, was based on centuries of trial and error, superstition, and anecdotal evidence, not scientific understanding of reproductive biology. Some substances might have had some minor effect on the menstrual cycle or caused irritation, but they were far from reliable contraceptives. And some, sadly, were outright poisons, taken in a desperate gamble that could easily backfire and cause severe illness or death. A quirky tidbit related to these beliefs is the use of non-physical methods, like carrying specific amulets or charms believed to possess the power to ward off pregnancy. You might tie a small pouch filled with certain herbs or symbols around your waist, or keep a charm hidden in your clothing, hoping that magical protection would succeed where physical methods failed. It was a testament to the lack of effective options that women would turn to such measures, blending practicality, however flawed, with superstition. It's like bringing your lucky socks to a job interview, comforting maybe, but probably not the deciding factor. The burden of prevention, despite the physical methods requiring client cooperation, fell overwhelmingly on the courtesan. It was your life, your body, your debt at risk. While clients might have been aware of the risks, their consequences were far less severe than yours. They didn't face the crushing debt increase, the social ruin within the district, or the physical dangers of later attempts to end a pregnancy. You were expected to manage the risk, to find a way, even when the available tools were laughably inadequate. This unequal burden was another stark reality of the power imbalance inherent in the system. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of these unreliable methods significantly impacted the overall birth rate within the Yoshiwara compared to the general population, or if other factors, like poor health and high rates of STIs, remember those, played a more dominant role in limiting pregnancies. It's a complex question, and the truth is likely a combination of many grim factors. The sheer mental toll of constantly trying to prevent pregnancy using such unreliable methods must have been immense. Every month was a terrifying waiting game. Every client interaction carried a silent, underlying risk. You were constantly on edge, performing your role while simultaneously navigating this hidden, life-altering threat. The whispered conversations with other women weren't just about sharing remedies. They were about sharing the fear, the anxiety, the desperate hope that this month, you would be safe. The lack of effective contraception meant that the line between prevention and termination was incredibly thin, often blurring into desperate attempts to induce menstruation if a period was late, using the same questionable herbs or methods. These were often harsh and dangerous, essentially early, risky attempts at abortion disguised as bringing on a late period. So you lived with this constant tightrope walk. You tried the withdrawal method, hoping for a responsible client. You might experiment with whispered about herbal remedies, crossing your fingers and hoping they wouldn't make you sick. You might even carry a lucky charm, adding a layer of magical thinking to the desperate equation. But underneath it all was the chilling knowledge that none of it was truly reliable. And that meant the terrifying possibility of a positive outcome, a pregnancy, was always lurking just beneath the surface of the glittering, artificial world you inhabited. And if that happened, if prevention failed, the next steps were even more dangerous, more desperate, and far less talked about openly. That cold dread, that pit in your stomach when your cycle was late, when all the desperate, unreliable attempts at prevention, the hoping the client withdrew in time, the whispered about herbs, the lucky charms, had failed? It solidified into a terrifying certainty. Prevention wasn't enough. Now, the goal wasn't to stop a potential life from starting. It was to stop a life that had already begun from continuing. And in the Yoshiwara, this wasn't just a personal crisis. It was an emergency of the highest order, demanding immediate, often secret, and incredibly dangerous action. A visible pregnancy was simply not tolerated. It meant you couldn't work, your value plummeted, and your debt would balloon uncontrollably, making escape virtually impossible. It was a problem that had to be solved, and the methods available were a grim reflection of the desperation. You learned quickly that the same women who whispered about ineffective contraceptive herbs were also the ones who knew about the herbs, concoctions, and practices believed to induce abortion. This knowledge was passed down woman to woman, a grim legacy of survival in a world that offered no safe alternatives. These weren't medical procedures performed by trained practitioners in sterile environments. That simply didn't exist. These were often desperate, dangerous experiments carried out in secret, in cramped quarters, with whatever questionable ingredients could be acquired. One common approach involved ingesting various herbal mixtures or teas believed to have abortifacient properties. The ingredients could range from relatively benign herbs to highly toxic substances. Some were meant to cause violent purges, hoping that the physical distress would terminate the pregnancy. Others were believed to directly affect the uterus. The recipes were often imprecise, the dosages uncertain, and the potential side effects severe. Taking these concoctions was a terrifying gamble. You might succeed in ending the pregnancy, or you might succeed in poisoning yourself, suffering agonizing pain, internal damage, or even death. It's like trying to defuse a bomb by randomly cutting wires, hoping you pick the right one and don't just blow yourself up. Physical methods were also attempted, often based on the belief that extreme physical stress could end a pregnancy. This could involve intense massage, particularly around the abdomen, which could cause internal injury and bleeding. It might also involve strenuous physical activity, like repeatedly jumping from a height, lifting heavy objects, or engaging in exhausting labor beyond your usual demanding routine. Imagine trying to induce a miscarriage by deliberately inflicting pain and trauma on your own body, all while trying to keep it secret from the madam and the house staff who were constantly watching. The sheer physical toll, let alone the emotional and psychological burden, must have been immense. You were literally trying to beat the pregnancy out of yourself. Invasive methods, often involving the insertion of objects or substances into the vagina or uterus, were also whispered about, though details are scarce in historical records due to the secrecy surrounding such practices. These could range from irritating substances meant to cause inflammation and shedding of the uterine lining, to sharp or blunt objects used to attempt to rupture the amniotic sac or injure the fetus. These methods carried an incredibly high risk of infection, severe bleeding, perforation of the uterus, and permanent internal damage. They were crude, dangerous, and often performed by individuals with no medical training, relying on folk knowledge and sheer desperation. Historians still argue whether certain tools depicted in later medical texts were actually used for abortion attempts in the Yoshiwara or if they represent practices from other areas or later periods. The lack of clear documentation reflects just how hidden and taboo these practices were. A quirky tidbit related to folk beliefs is the idea that certain foods or drink could induce abortion. While some substances might have had minor effects on the body, the idea that eating or drinking something specific could reliably terminate a pregnancy was largely superstitious. Nevertheless, women desperate for a solution would try anything, consuming things that were unpleasant, unhealthful, or simply ineffective, driven by the slim hope that it might work. It highlights the profound lack of accurate information and safe options available to them. The secrecy surrounding these attempts was paramount. If the house madam discovered you were pregnant and attempting to terminate it, the consequences could be severe. You might be punished, neglected, or even cast out if you were deemed too much of a liability, leaving you with nowhere to go and no means of survival. So, these desperate acts were often carried out in the dead of night, in whispered conversations, with trusted friends, or with clandestine visits to unreliable practitioners outside the house walls, adding another layer of risk and fear to an already terrifying situation. A mainstream historical fact about abortion in Edo-era Japan is that while it was not strictly legal or openly practiced, it was a known reality across society, often referred to euphemistically as mabiki, thinning out, like thinning crops, or other indirect terms, particularly in rural areas facing economic hardship. The Yoshiwara's unique circumstances simply amplified the desperation and frequency of such attempts among the courtesans. This wasn't a practice invented within the district, but the pressures of the Yoshiwara system made it a tragically common necessity for the women trapped within it. The emotional toll of making such a choice, of resorting to such dangerous methods, must have been immense. Faced with the impossible choice between a life-altering, debt-inflating pregnancy that could ruin you, and the terrifying risks of attempting to end it, many women were forced into desperate actions they would never have considered in other circumstances. The constant fear, the secrecy, the physical pain, and the knowledge that you were risking your life with every attempt, it was a heavy, heavy burden to carry alone. And often, despite the risks, these desperate attempts failed, or they succeeded at a terrible cost, leaving the woman severely injured, infertile, or worse. The physical consequences of these dangerous practices were often as devastating as the unwanted pregnancy itself. You remember the whispers, the desperate shared knowledge about herbs and methods meant to end a pregnancy. You remember the cold fear that drove you, or the women around you, to consider such drastic measures. But the terrifying truth is that attempting to terminate a pregnancy in Edo-era Japan, using the methods available, wasn't just unreliable. It was incredibly, brutally dangerous. The physical toll these desperate acts exacted was immense, and the line between a failed abortion attempt and a fatal outcome was terrifyingly thin. You weren't just risking the pregnancy, you were risking your life. The herbal concoctions, whispered about as potential solutions, were a gamble with your own body. Ingesting substances meant to induce violent contractions or purges could lead to severe internal distress. Imagine the cramping, the nausea, the agony as your body reacted violently to whatever unknown mixture you had consumed. Some herbs were outright poisons, causing liver damage, kidney failure, or severe internal bleeding. Taking them was like playing a grim game of Russian roulette with your own organs. You might succeed in your desperate goal, or you might simply make yourself incredibly, perhaps fatally, ill, adding another layer of suffering to your already precarious existence. It wasn't exactly a pleasant spa treatment, let's just say that. Physical methods like intense massage or deliberately inflicting trauma through strenuous activity also came with horrific risks. Trying to end a pregnancy by jumping repeatedly or lifting impossibly heavy objects could lead to severe internal injuries, ruptured organs, internal bleeding, damage to your spine or limbs. Imagine the pain, the bruising, the hidden injuries you had to conceal while still trying to maintain the facade of being healthy enough to work. You might succeed in causing a miscarriage, but you could also permanently damage your body, leaving you with chronic pain, mobility issues, or internal injuries that would plague you for the rest of your potentially short life. It was a self-inflicted wound born of desperation, a grim testament to the impossible situation you were in. And the more invasive methods, whispered about in hushed tones, carried perhaps the highest risks of all. Inserting objects or substances into the body to try and disrupt the pregnancy was incredibly dangerous in a time without sterile medical tools or understanding of infection. The risk of introducing bacteria was immense, leading to rampant, often fatal, infections. Sepsis, a full-body inflammatory response to infection, was a terrifyingly common outcome. Imagine a raging fever, excruciating pain, and the rapid deterioration of your body as infections spread unchecked. Puncturing the uterus or causing severe internal trauma could lead to massive hemorrhaging, bleeding that wouldn't stop, quickly leading to shock and death. These were not medical procedures. They were acts of desperation performed with crude implements and dangerous ignorance, often resulting in horrific injury or death. It was like trying to perform surgery with a butter knife and a prayer. A mainstream historical fact about this era is that maternal mortality rates were significantly higher than in modern times, even for planned pregnancies and births, due to factors like poor sanitation, limited medical knowledge, and complications during labor. Adding the trauma of unsafe, attempted abortions dramatically increased these risks for women in the Yoshiwara. If an attempt failed and didn't cause immediate death, it could still leave you severely injured or permanently disabled. Internal damage could lead to chronic pain, difficulty with basic bodily functions, and crucially, infertility. While infertility might seem like a grim form of success in preventing future pregnancies, It was a devastating physical consequence, a permanent reminder of the trauma your body had endured. And a woman who was chronically ill or infertile might be seen as even less valuable to the house, making her debt situation even more hopeless. The secrecy surrounding these attempts only compounded the danger. You couldn't openly seek medical help if something went wrong. Admitting to an attempted abortion could lead to severe punishment from the house madam, or even social ostracism within the district. So you suffered in silence, trying to hide your pain, your bleeding, the signs of infection, hoping your body would heal itself or that the symptoms would pass. This meant that complications, which might have been treatable with even basic care, were often left unattended, allowing infection to spread or bleeding to become fatal. It was a lonely, terrifying ordeal, often faced without comfort or medical support. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates specifically among Yoshiwara courtesans were more attributable to the risks of unsafe abortion practices or to the cumulative effects of STIs, overwork, poor nutrition, and other infectious diseases prevalent in the district. It's likely a tragic interplay of all these factors. But the dangers of pregnancy termination attempts undoubtedly played a significant role in many premature deaths. A quirky tidbit related to the aftermath of these attempts is the use of specific rituals or prayers aimed at appeasing the spirits of lost pregnancies or ensuring the woman's recovery. In a world where medical understanding was limited, spiritual beliefs often filled the gap, offering a sense of control or hope in the face of devastating physical realities. It was a way of processing the trauma and the loss, blending desperation with tradition. The physical toll wasn't just immediate, it was cumulative. Even if an attempt didn't kill you, the damage done, combined with the already harsh living conditions, the constant exhaustion, the poor diet, and the ever-present threat of STIs, wore your body down relentlessly. Your health was constantly under siege. This is why the lifespan of a Yoshiwara courtesan was often tragically short compared to women outside the district. They weren't just dying from disease, they were dying from the life itself, a life that demanded constant performance and offered few protections, especially when it came to the fundamental vulnerability of their reproductive health. You lived with the knowledge that trying to escape the consequences of a pregnancy could be as deadly as letting it continue would be ruinous. It was a no-win situation, a horrifying choice forced upon you by the system. The physical scars, visible or hidden, and the constant threat of fatal complications were a grim reality lurking beneath the painted faces and silk kimonos. The beauty presented to the world was bought at a terrible physical price, a price that could ultimately cost you everything. And sometimes, despite all the desperate attempts, all the risks taken, the pregnancy couldn't be stopped. Then, a whole new set of grim realities had to be faced, the fate of the child. That cold dread, that pit in your stomach when your cycle was late, when all the desperate, unreliable attempts at prevention, the hoping the client withdrew in time, the whispered about herbs, the lucky charms, had failed? It solidified into a terrifying certainty. Prevention wasn't enough. And sometimes, despite all the risks taken with dangerous methods you learned about in the last section, despite the physical toll and the fear of fatal complications, the pregnancy couldn't be stopped. Then, a whole new set of grim realities had to be faced, the fate of the child. In the Yoshiwara, a visible, undeniable pregnancy was simply not tolerated. It was an emergency of the highest order, demanding immediate, often secret, and incredibly dangerous action. A pregnant courtesan meant lost income for the house. Her body, the primary tool of her labor, was temporarily out of commission. Remember how the debt kept growing even when you were sick? A pregnancy was an extended period of being unable to earn, meaning your debt would balloon uncontrollably, making any distant hope of freedom vanish like smoke in the wind. From the house madam's perspective, you weren't just pregnant, you were a significant financial liability, a drain on resources in a business built on constant turnover and profit. The system of the Yoshiwara, with its strict rules and relentless schedule, offered no place for a child. There was no nursery, no childcare facilities, no allowances for a courtesan to take time off to raise a baby. Children born within the district faced immense social stigma, both inside and outside the walls. They were often referred to with derogatory terms, seen as products of a shameful profession. A child was an obstacle, a complication that disrupted the carefully orchestrated illusion of the floating world. Imagine trying to maintain that serene, beautiful facade while also trying to hide a growing belly, or worse, care for a crying infant in the cramped, shared living quarters. It was simply incompatible with the demands of the job and the expectations of the house. It's like trying to run a high-end art gallery while simultaneously hosting a toddler's birthday party in the main exhibition hall. It just doesn't work. So, what happened when a pregnancy couldn't be prevented or terminated? The options were few, grim, and dictated by the harsh realities of the district. For the house, the priority was to deal with the situation as quickly and discreetly as possible to minimize financial loss and maintain appearances. For you, the pregnant courtesan, you were likely subjected to intense pressure from the madam and house staff to find a solution. One tragic possibility, whispered about but rarely openly acknowledged, was infanticide. In a society where poverty and hardship were widespread, and social safety nets non-existent, infanticide, particularly of female infants, was a grim reality in many parts of Edo-era Japan, especially in rural areas during times of famine or economic distress. The term mabiki, which literally means thinning out crops, was sometimes euphemistically used to refer to the practice of infanticide, highlighting its association with economic necessity. In the hyper-pressurized, economically driven environment of the Yoshiwara, the pressures that could lead to such an unthinkable act were amplified. A child born to a courtesan had no legal father recognized by the system, clients were anonymous or married men outside the district, no family structure within the Yoshiwara, and no way to be integrated into the life there. They were, in essence, born into a system that had no place for them. While direct evidence within historical records of widespread, systematic infanticide within the Yoshiwara houses is difficult to come by due to the secrecy surrounding such acts, the immense pressures placed upon pregnant courtesans and the lack of viable alternatives made it a tragically possible outcome in some cases. Historians still argue whether infanticide was a frequent occurrence within the Yoshiwara itself, or if the more common outcome was for the child to be sent away. The truth is likely a mix of both, depending on the specific house, the circumstances, and the individuals involved. If the child was allowed to be born, or if infanticide was not chosen or possible, the most common fate was for the infant to be sent away from the district. This could involve handing the child over to relatives outside the Yoshiwara, if you had any family who were willing and able to take in a child born under such circumstances, which was often not the case due to the stigma. More often, the child might be given to wet nurses or foster families in rural areas outside of Edo. This was not done out of kindness, it was a transaction. The house would pay a fee to the foster family for the child's upkeep, adding this cost to your ever-growing debt. Imagine the heartbreak of giving birth after enduring all the risks and secrecy, only to have your baby taken away almost immediately, sent to live with strangers, all while knowing that their very existence was adding to the chains that bound you to the Yoshiwara. It's a level of emotional cruelty that's hard to comprehend. It's like being forced to pay for the privilege of having your heart broken. These children, if they survived, grew up away from their mothers, often unaware of their true parentage or the circumstances of their birth. They might be raised as farm laborers or domestic servants, their lives shaped by the secrecy and stigma of their origins. Some might eventually learn the truth, leading to complicated and often painful reunions, or a lifelong search for a mother they never knew. A quirky tidbit is that in some cases, if the child was a girl and the house madam saw potential, she might arrange for the child to be raised outside the district until she was old enough, often around 7 to 10 years old, to be brought back into the Yoshiwara as a kamuro, beginning the cycle anew. While this might sound like a grim form of family business, it was also, in a twisted way, a form of investment by the house, ensuring a future supply of labor. It's like a dark, historical version of a corporate internship program, but the interns are children and the career path is lifelong debt. The birthing process itself, in the conditions of the Yoshiwara and without proper medical care, was incredibly dangerous. Remember the high maternal mortality rates we mentioned? Giving birth in a cramped room, possibly without skilled attendants, while trying to keep it quiet, only increased the risks. If you survived the birth, the recovery period added further to your inability to work and the accumulation of debt. The emotional toll of carrying a pregnancy to term in secret, enduring the birth, and then having the child taken away must have been devastating. There was no space for grieving, no time for recovery, physical or emotional. You were expected to heal quickly, regain your pre-pregnancy figure, another physical pressure, and return to work to start paying off the debt that had just increased significantly. The memory of the child, the brief time you may have held them, became another hidden burden, a silent sorrow carried beneath the painted smile. The fate of children born in the Yoshiwara highlights the fundamental inhumanity of the system. It commodified women's bodies to such an extent that even the natural outcome of sexual activity, pregnancy and childbirth, was treated as a problem to be erased or outsourced, regardless of the human cost to the mother or the child. There was no room for family, no space for motherhood, only the relentless demands of the floating world's economy. You've seen the harsh realities of the Yoshiwara, the crushing debt, the demanding routine, the constant threat of illness, the desperate measures taken to avoid pregnancy, and the heartbreaking fate of children born into the system. It feels like a trap, a gilded cage from which there is no escape. And for the vast majority of women who entered the floating world, tragically, that was the truth. They lived their lives within those walls, bound by contracts and debt, until illness, age, or death released them. But there were rare exceptions. Flickers of possibility, paths that, while incredibly narrow and difficult, offered a glimpse of a life outside the district, a life of freedom. This section is about those rare, hard-won escapes. The most straightforward, albeit incredibly difficult, path to freedom was paying off the debt. Remember that mountain of debt that started the moment you arrived, accumulating with every kimono, every meal, every lesson? Theoretically, once that debt was repaid to the house madam, the contract was fulfilled, and you were free to leave. However, as we discussed back in Section 7, remember the heavy chains? The system was designed to make this almost impossible through your own earnings. The costs of living and working in the Yoshiwara were deliberately inflated, and the portion of your earnings applied to the principal debt was often minuscule. It was like trying to empty a bathtub with a teacup while someone was constantly turning the faucet on higher. For most women, especially those in the lower ranks, working diligently for years, even decades, would barely make a dent in the total amount owed. So, if earning your freedom through sheer labor was a near impossible feat, what other avenues existed? The most common way for a courtesan to leave the Yoshiwara was not by paying off her debt herself, but by having someone else pay it for her. This usually meant a wealthy client. A client who had perhaps developed a genuine affection for a courtesan, or who simply wished to display his wealth and status by redeeming a celebrated figure from the district, could negotiate with the house madam to pay the remaining balance of her contract. This act, known as myuk, was a significant event, requiring considerable funds, often equivalent to many years of a courtesan's potential earnings. Historians still argue whether these acts of redemption were primarily driven by genuine love and affection from the client, or if they were more about a display of wealth, status, and the desire to possess a highly sought-after woman. The truth is likely complex and vary from case to case, but the outcome for the woman was the same: freedom from the Yoshiwara. Being bought out by a client was a dream for many courtesans, romanticized in stories and plays. It represented a potential escape from the drudgery, the debt, and the dangers of the life. However, it was a reality for only a tiny fraction of the women in the district, primarily those of higher ranks who had the opportunity to cultivate long-term relationships with wealthy patrons. A lower-ranking courtesan, dealing with a rapid turnover of clients and less opportunity for personal connection, was far less likely to attract a patron willing or able to pay such a substantial sum. It was the historical equivalent of winning the lottery, except the prize was just getting your old life back. Another, even rarer, path to freedom was for the courtesan's family to somehow manage to scrape together the funds to pay off her debt. This was incredibly uncommon, as most families who had sold a daughter into the Yoshiwara were already in dire economic circumstances. The amount owed often grew far beyond the initial sum they received, making it an impossible burden for them to bear years later. The stigma associated with having a daughter in the Yoshiwara also meant that even if a family could afford it, they might be reluctant to reintegrate her into their lives or community. It's like trying to pay off a modern student loan debt, but the interest rate is 500% and your parents are living on ramen noodles. When a courtesan was finally redeemed, either by a client or, in extremely rare cases, by her family, there was often a formal ceremony to mark her departure. This was not just a matter of packing a bag and walking out the gate. It was a ritualized transition from the floating world back to the real world, or at least, a different version of it. A quirky tidbit about this process is that it sometimes involved symbolic acts, such as the courtesan burning her elaborate hairpins, which were symbols of her profession and rank within the Yoshiwara, or changing her clothes from the distinctive, flamboyant styles of the district to more subdued attire typical of women outside. It was a visual shedding of her courtesan identity, a physical manifestation of her newfound freedom, even if the emotional and psychological transition was far more complex. Imagine finally taking off that ridiculously heavy wig and burning it. Probably felt pretty good, honestly. Leaving the Yoshiwara didn't mean all your troubles vanished overnight. Life outside the gilded cage presented its own set of challenges. The social stigma associated with having been a courtesan was immense. Even if you were redeemed and married to a client, you might face ostracism from his family or the wider community. Your past was not easily erased, and integrating into mainstream Edo society could be incredibly difficult. You might lack the practical skills needed for life outside the entertainment quarter, having spent years focused on arts, etiquette, and pleasing clients rather than managing a household or working in a conventional trade. It was a bit like graduating from a very specific, highly demanding finishing school that didn't teach you how to, say, grocery shop or do laundry. Some women who gained their freedom went on to marry their patrons and live relatively conventional lives, although often still under the shadow of their past. Others might try to start businesses, sometimes using the skills they acquired in the Yoshiwara, like managing a tea house or a small shop. A mainstream historical fact is that some former high-ranking courtesans, particularly those with significant cultural accomplishments and wealthy patrons, were able to transition successfully into respectable lives outside the district and even became influential figures in Edo society, proving that escape, while rare, was not always a transition into further hardship. Their stories became legends, offering a glimmer of hope to those still trapped inside. However, for many who left, life was still a struggle. They carried the physical toll of the life, the chronic pain from injuries sustained during training or dangerous abortion attempts. Remember Section 12? The lingering effects of illness, like STIs from Section 5, the sheer exhaustion. They carried the emotional scars of years of confinement, debt, and transactional relationships. Freedom from the Yoshiwara didn't erase the trauma of having lived there. It was a new chapter, but the previous chapters were indelibly marked on your body and soul. The possibility of escape, no matter how remote, was a powerful motivator for many women. It was the fuel that kept you going through the relentless training, the long nights, the constant fear. You clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, you would be one of the lucky few, that a client would see past the painted face and the elaborate kimono to the person underneath, and offer you a way out. Or that you could somehow, against all odds, earn enough to break free. It was a fragile hope, constantly threatened by the crushing reality of the debt and the system's design, but it was a hope nonetheless. It was the light at the end of a very long, very dark tunnel, even if that light was often just a distant, flickering candle. The journey out was arduous, the destination uncertain, but the desire for freedom was a powerful current beneath the surface of the floating world. You've journeyed through the gilded cage of the Yoshiwara, witnessing the beauty and the pain, the strict rules and the crushing debt, the desperate attempts at prevention and the grim fate of children. You've seen the rare, difficult paths to freedom, and the reality that for most, escape was not a physical departure but a transition within the walls, from youth to age, from health to illness, from potential to despair. The women who lived and died within that district are long gone, their voices silenced by time, but their echoes remain, their stories preserved, however imperfectly, in art, literature, and historical records. This final part of our journey is about reflecting on their legacy, understanding how they are remembered, and finding some calm in the closing of this chapter. What remains of the Yoshiwara today? The physical district in Edo was destroyed by fire, and is now part of modern-day Tokyo. The grand houses are gone, replaced by different buildings and a different kind of nightlife. But the floating world lives on in the collective memory, largely shaped by the art and stories created about it during its time. Woodblock prints, known as ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, were incredibly popular, depicting the courtesans in exquisite detail. Their elaborate kimonos, their intricate hairstyles, their serene, painted faces. These prints were the pin-ups and fashion magazines of their day, showcasing the celebrities of the district and influencing trends outside its walls. They presented a highly idealized vision of the Yoshiwara, focusing on the beauty, the fashion, the cultural accomplishments, and the romanticized interactions with clients. They often glossed over the harsh realities, the debt, the disease, the lack of freedom, the desperation. Looking at these prints, it's easy to be captivated by the surface beauty and forget the human cost behind it. It's like judging a reality TV show by the perfectly edited highlight reel, ignoring all the drama and tears that happened off camera. Beyond the visual arts, the stories of the Yoshiwara courtesans were immortalized in literature and theater. Plays, particularly those written for the kabuki stage, often featured courtesans as central characters, portraying them as tragic heroines, cunning manipulators, or figures of unattainable beauty and wit. These stories, while entertaining, also contributed to the romanticized image of the district, often focusing on dramatic love affairs, tragic double suicides, *Shinju*, remember? Or the rare triumphs of women who achieved freedom. They reinforced the idea of the Yoshiwara as a world of passion and drama, rather than a place of intense labor and economic exploitation. Historians still argue whether these artistic and literary portrayals accurately reflected the lives and experiences of the majority of women in the Yoshiwara, or if they primarily served to entertain and fulfill the fantasies of the male-dominated audience and artists. It's likely a complex mix. But it's crucial to remember that the most widely available accounts were filtered through the perspectives of those outside the system. The legacy of the Yoshiwara courtesans is complex and, at times, contradictory. They were women who were simultaneously celebrated and marginalized, admired for their beauty and skills, yet trapped by their circumstances and profession. They were figures of fantasy and desire, yet they endured immense hardship and lacked basic rights and freedoms. They were artists and performers, but their performances were inextricably linked to their economic bondage and sexual exploitation. It's difficult to reconcile the image of the refined, cultured Oiran with the reality of the lower-ranking women struggling with disease and constant debt, and yet, they were all part of the same system. A mainstream historical fact is that the Yoshiwara district existed for centuries, from the early Edo period until its closure in 1958, undergoing various transformations and regulations over time. This longevity highlights its deep integration into Japanese society and economy, and the persistent demand for the services it provided. The closure in the mid-20th century marked the end of a specific era of licensed prostitution in Japan, but the stories and issues surrounding the Yoshiwara continue to resonate. A quirky tidbit about their enduring presence is that some traditional Japanese arts, like specific styles of music, dance, and even tea ceremony practices, were heavily influenced and preserved by the courtesans of the Yoshiwara, particularly the high-ranking ones who were trained to a high degree of cultural sophistication. They weren't just passive subjects of art, they were active participants in shaping aspects of Edo culture, acting as patrons and practitioners of the arts. It's a reminder that even within a system of constraint, they found ways to contribute and leave their mark beyond just the transactional. Reflecting on their lives, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the tragedy and hardship. The debt, the illness, the lost hope, the impossible choices around pregnancy. Remember the dangerous methods and the fate of the children. But it's also important to acknowledge their resilience, their ability to survive and even, in rare cases, thrive within such a challenging environment. The friendships they forged, the moments of genuine connection they found, the skills they mastered, These were acts of defiance against a system designed to strip them of their humanity. Their stories serve as a stark reminder of the complex interplay of economic forces, social structures, gender inequality, and individual agency throughout history. They challenge us to look beyond the surface, to question romanticized narratives, and to remember the human cost of systems that commodify and exploit. They remind us that even in the most controlled environments, the human spirit finds ways to endure, to connect, and to dream of freedom. As we dim the lights and drift away from the bustling, complex, and often heartbreaking world of the Yoshiwara, let the images fade gently. The scent of incense and perfume, the distant sound of the shamisen, the rustle of silk kimonos, the quiet shuffling of geta on cobblestones. Let the faces of the women, painted and poised, soften in your mind. The debt, the fear, the pain, let those heavy burdens lift. They were real people who lived real lives, however constrained, and their stories deserve to be remembered, not just as historical footnotes, but as testaments to the enduring, often difficult, journey of the human spirit. As you settle deeper into the quiet of the night, let the echoes of the floating world become fainter, softer, until they dissolve into the calm darkness.